You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
It can seem to occur on an almost daily basis. Popular media trumpet a breakthrough in the development of new substances with extraordinary properties and applications that make it possible to do something heretofore a matter of science fiction. Writing in May 2020, Peter Diamandis cited three such breakthroughs, literally changing today's world. Lithium-ion batteries power everything from smartphones to cars due to the capacity to store vast amounts of energy in relatively small devices. Graphene is a nearly weightless substance, but one that is 200 times stronger than steel and therefore a remarkably versatile material for building almost anything. And perovskite, a widely available and relatively inexpensive light-sensitive crystal that increases solar panels' capacity to improve the capture of sunlight from 16 to 66%. Within just the last month, a team of Northwestern University researchers led by James A. Rogers was able to announce development of a tiny, soft, and flexible implant to the body that relieves pain on demand without the use of drugs, thereby providing an alternative to opioids and other addictive medicines. Our guest on Innovators was just honored by his home institution, Tufts University, on the occasion of his election to the National Academy of Engineering, and for the work of him and his lab, most recently in using molded silk, a 5,000-year-old discovery by the Chinese, to create entirely new products for medical devices to environmental needs. He and his lab are also making progress in other areas of material science in creating meat from animal cells, cellular agriculture, if you will. But lest material science be celebrated only for its recent, current, and future breakthroughs, it's useful to remember that we describe the very history of the Earth and man's time on it in terms of materials, hence the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and so forth. David Kaplan is Distinguished Professor and Stern Family Professor of Engineering and Chair of Biomedical Engineering at Tufts. He earned the doctorate from SUNY Syracuse and Syracuse University and his undergraduate degree from the State University at Albany. He served as a director of the National Institutes of Health Resource Center on Tissue Engineering and was a research scientist at NATIC Labs before joining the faculty at Tufts. Dr. Kaplan has published nearly 1,000 peer-reviewed articles. He and his lab's efforts have found applications in dentistry, human and veterinary medicine, biology, and nutrition. Dr. Kaplan, welcome to Innovators. This seems to be a fairly fertile time for the material science, and it's not altogether clear to me why this is such a fertile time. So I guess I'd like to ask, in the years you've been doing major research activities for 25, 30 years, what have been the things that have accelerated the invention and the innovation that we're starting to see now? Are there distinctive reasons why this is such a particularly fertile time?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of drivers here, and maybe it's a bit biased from my own sort of research history and where we started, but I think if you look at I don't want to call it the consumer, but sort of the public view of the world, it's changed. And one of the things that drives materials is really the public view of, what's in the environment, what's contaminating the environment, what do people care about? And when you see videos of these massive plastic waste depots in the ocean and all this, that people, surprising, because I didn't think it would ever happen in my lifetime, but it is happening. People do care. And so I think on the one thing, there's this consumer drive to say, can't we do better? And that trickles down to federal agencies that fund research, that trickles down to labs like mine that say, okay, guys, come up with a better, a new direction to go in materials that doesn't cause this environmental calamity, that's more sustainable and healthier for all of us going forward. So I think that's one global driver for that has made a big difference. And I say that because my entire career, God knows it's been decades, right? But I never thought anyone would care this much. So it's just glorious to see that people finally care, because we studied biopolymers and biopolymer engineering for 35 years, and it's always been feeling like you're the one or two labs in the world that cares, right?
Mhm.
And now everyone's getting on board, which is, a beautiful thing. So that's one. I think the other is just the tools, the analytical tools and the research tools have really grown in the last 10, 15 years. And, a couple of things I think about. One is just the tools for genetic engineering are just
Exactly.
so much easier and available.
Mhm.
So if you want to design the next generation of protein polymers that can achieve specific functions, you can do it now. You don't need to be an expert in molecular biology to do it reasonably well. So I think that's helped a
Mhm.
lot. And the other is just, I call it the analytics, understanding what you made and whether it's going to do the job. You now have so many great imaging tools, structural analysis tools that didn't exist in a reasonable fashion. You had to be an expert in the past, right? But now
Mhm.
you don't. So I think that gives you a way to assess if you're going in the right direction a lot easier, a lot faster, and then you can feedback and do it better and better. So, those are some of the drivers I think that have allowed the field to grow.
There's a question that always comes up in sort of cocktail party conversation, that somebody invokes the argument that the reason we now have coffee machines that work is because NASA put people on the moon and they had to find some plastic that was a lot more lightweight and so forth. And I am kind of curious about that, is that this ability to come up with new materials, which is so striking, that materials that seem to be so far-fetched in their capacities and their capabilities. And so this notion that the public concern for the environment and for what we're doing to the environment. And on the flip side of that is a consumerism. There's a willingness to undertake new kinds of materials that heretofore we wouldn't have possible. So it's driven in some ways, interestingly enough, as you indicated, by a kind of broader public receptivity. And to some extent, maybe this has been tempered of late, by the question of capacity of science to render things useful. So there's that. That kind of leads me to ask another question that you've already touched on. Virtually all of your career, not all of it, but most of your career has been in academia. But much of the research and some of the applications take place elsewhere, in business and industry and government and large scale labs. If you were to sort out which of those sectors has been the one that's carried the burden or the opportunity of what's going on in material science, is there one that has sort of taken on the leadership role? And what have the others done to either supplement that role or to complement that role?
Let's see, I think with apologies, there's a multitude of answers. I think if you look at specific federal agencies that are driving innovation, if that's really the question here, I would say you start with DARPA. For example, 10 years ago, we had a program that DARPA funded, which was on robotics. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not a robotics laboratory, right? We work on materials and tissues and food and things like that. But we put in a proposal. DARPA had a request for proposals on next generation robots. And so we said, we're not going to build a robot, we're going to grow a robot. Okay. Sounds crazy, right? But in fact, that's what the tools of tissue engineering can do: growing muscle actuators, growing skins, growing fuel sources. These are things animals do all the time, but we haven't translated that into devices, machines, and so on. So that spurred our lab in a whole bunch of new directions, because DARPA was willing to put funds behind, I don't want to say crazy ideas, just new ideas that
Mhm.
didn't have a real basis yet in anything. It was just ideas, right? So I think DARPA is a window into innovation that drives a lot of this from the federal agency side.
And that's been true for at least 25, 30, 40
As
years.
long as DARPA's existed, if you ask me.
Exactly.
And it can be metals, it can be energy,
Mhm.
it doesn't matter, batteries, it all
Mhm.
starts there in my mind. And then I also think, because we've worked with, both the Air Force labs, we've worked with Army labs, we worked with the Navy labs, and there's always what I call more specialized areas where there's a lot of drive towards new materials to meet their functional goals. For example, the Air Force has been very active in how do you learn from biology to apply those insights to new kinds of sensors, as one example. And they're really, able to do it, and then it's funded through the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. The Navy has done the same thing in biofouling and so on. And the Army, if you think about it, even things like protection, new
Yes.
materials for protection, but also food, and how are you going to generate rations and store rations, so preservation. So I think federal agencies like that do drive innovation. I don't see, in the old days, this is even before my time, if possible, you used to have the Bell Labs and all these
Exactly.
centers of innovation. They're all gone. So I don't think you see that anymore. And most, at least my myopic view, most of the companies out there look for startups that are doing the innovation, and then they just buy them out or assimilate them in different ways. And so I think a lot of the innovation is really out of academic labs as a startup, to take it from the research to, a more focused, whether it's a product or more development focused, and then on from there. So that innovation, I think, is more driven from the academic and small business side.
Someone pointed out to me that much of the work in drones had to do with the ability to develop new materials that would make aircraft, in this case, unmanned aircraft, much lighter, and they're able to sustain. That's kind of far down the line, because you had to have the basic research that got that started. How do you create a new substance like that?
Right.
But it does sound as though we've gone through now a generational change away from the large scale labs like the Bell Labs and the like. And now it really does rest in academia to a large extent, albeit there's a much greater likelihood that the academy will spawn startup businesses that will in turn take on the responsibility of commercializing that in some way.
That's my take as well. And just one other note about that: if you look at the growing field of cellular agriculture, which we're involved in, there's still materials in there in terms of the scaffolding, to support cells. The same evolution there. There's been an immense investment in the private sector in these startup companies. Now we're past 100 in the U.S. alone, I think, of trying to grow different foods of the future through cell and so on. And yet there's almost no investment in the academic side. And so there's this, I call it kind of the reverse valley of death, where the public doesn't know. The public doesn't have confidence, because you don't know what these companies are really making and doing, right? So you need to fill that gap. And so I think there needs to be this investment in the academic side to drive some of that innovation. Exactly. And marry that with what the startups are doing. So that'll happen over time. But it's been a very interesting, different.
That is a different model.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, we were interviewing Mike Larimore. He used to be the dean at UC Davis, dean of veterinary medicine at UC Davis. You probably know Mike. And Mike was talking about the time is that they were working on the challenge of finding a way to develop tendons, well, especially for horses, because they snap tendons. Somebody once said that horses were described by somebody who wanted to make a large amount of money as a veterinarian. But he pointed out that much of the work in tissue and cellular activities in terms of developing new materials has a lot to do with the spawned out of the California agricultural area. But now what you just said struck me, that we have virtually no work going on in the academy, and it's all being done elsewhere. So that's striking. The other striking thing that I am always come away with from talking to people like you and looking at the field is there's a decided comfort level with being interdisciplinary in material science. You can recall, I hope, maybe 20 years ago, that when NSF and other forces kept pushing people to do interdisciplinary work, there was pushback. There was some serious pushback. This is, no, I'm a biologist and you're a chemist and so forth. But material science seems to always have been interdisciplinary to me. Is that a function, I guess, of the subject matter, the fact that it really isn't definable, or at least I've never heard it being defined in some narrow way? Or is it the fact that so much of material science does get translated in a somewhat shorter period of time than other fields into some practical? What is it that makes the interdisciplinary character of material science seemingly effortless. It just seems to happen naturally. What is that? Where did that come from?
Well, I think from my perspective, it comes from two things at least. One is, as someone who has always looked at nature as the source of inspiration for materials and material designs and what works. I think you can't escape the fact that nature creates materials that have to function in a context, right? They're not just materials for materials, right? They're materials, for example, that allow a tree to grow tall against gravity and transport nutrients up to the leaves, right? And some of those are the most
magnificent. And know when to stop growing.
And they know when to stop growing, or they're limited in growth because of fundamental physical phenomena, whatever it is, right? But they can survive way longer than human beings. They can last through fires. They can last through any environmental challenge other than maybe climate warming. We'll see what happens. My point is there's a lot to be learned there, right? And so if you look at that, none of those materials are, whether they're created, evolved, designed, whatever, happen in a vacuum. They're always in the context of the local environment and the biological components that go with the local environment, right? So that's a lesson learned right there, right? If you're going to build your lab and your research on that, you've got to understand context, right? And so that's one. And the other is any materials we make today are either going to go in the human body, on the human body, in the environment. And so you have to know how they're going to interact. If you don't do that, you're wasting your time, because you could design the most interesting mechanical device that no one's ever seen before, but if it's not going to last 2 minutes when you put it in a marine environment, what's the point?
So let's use an example, your lab. I know it's a large lab, but could you give us a sense of the disciplines that are represented in there?
Sure. I mean, obviously and I can speak to just who's in my lab even, right? My postdocs, my students. So some are molecular biologists, some are zoologists, some are material science and engineer folks, some are mechanical engineers, some are analytical chemists, some are cell biologists. And then we work very actively with, depending on the field, with people who look at economics, like we do what are called LCAs, TEAs, life cycle analysis, techno-economics. So, I mean, they're all part of the team, right? And you need them today, because if I'm going to make the next material, I need to have the right way to make it. I need to understand what I've made, and I need to understand how it's going to last in the human body or out in the environment. So it's just part of the process, right? It's a systems approach. It's not an isolated approach.
It's it seems to me that's also one of the sources of the success, is that the disciplines don't get in the way. You don't stumble over silos. And it seems to me that may be a factor that perhaps that allows material science to make this kind of explosion of discoveries.
I think that's very perceptive, and that's a really good thing. However, I'll tell you the bad thing about it. And I don't want to call it the bad thing, but the challenge. If you do that well, that means you need a very large lab, right? Because you need everybody working for the common theme. And so this is a challenge, because it's very hard to fund a very large lab, right? I'm not complaining. We've been very fortunate, but it makes it tough for junior faculty to navigate that process to get where you need to be, because it's hard to raise money today, So I worry about this gap that I see, and we'll see what happens. But that's a real issue.
Well, there are stories of you having shaved your head and worn a saffron robe with your rice bowl out in Medford. On the street.
It's a tin cup. It's a tin cup.
Tin cup. Oh, it's a tin cup.
That's close enough.
Oh, that's close enough. Okay.
I'm equal opportunity when it comes to a container to a receipt.
I understand.
Yeah. Okay.
Bless you, sir. You're so magnanimous. I want to turn to a question that I hope I don't put you too much on the spot, but you've been successful for years now, and you run a large lab. And so I want to talk a little bit about leadership, which I don't know how many courses you took in leadership when you were up in the upstate New York, but it does seem to me that it takes a certain kind of leader in an organization to take on the kind of work that material science does. This, as you pointed out, there's first the disciplines. Now that seems not to be a big issue, but the sheer size of it, the complexity of it, and the fact that you have to fund it more or less on an annual basis. There's very little carryover money or any sustained money for long periods of time. So without embarrassing you to tell me about all your wonderful virtues, I would like to know, what are the attributes of effective administrators and executives to undertake and make possible the kind of material science research you're doing? What makes that possible in the people who lead it?
Very tough question. I'd say that's a question, and I'm being serious when I say it's better to ask my former students, current students, whatever, or my colleagues, because, who knows, right? But the things I've leaned on and I find important to me, and first of all, no, I've never taken a leadership course in my life, which is good or bad, I don't know, right? So one is and I call it, and maybe I'm getting too global about this. I think there's a problem today, and generally leadership, however you want to define it, people are afraid to lead. And so when I say that, I mean, by design, you need someone who has enough confidence or belief in what they believe is right, or the right way to do it, or what's important, to be willing to say that and do that, not just wait for a committee of 1,000 to give you an X bar. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
No, I understand exactly.
You have to be willing to do that and be willing to be wrong, right? And be willing to learn at the same time. So I tell my students all the time, I don't care if I'm right. This is what I think. Prove me wrong, and then you make my day. And I really believe that, and that's a great thing when I have a student that comes to me and say, "Hey, Dave, this is what I did, and look, it was different. It wasn't what you said." And I'm like, "Great, okay." So you definitely have to be confident in your ideas. You have to be creative enough in your ideas, and then you have to be willing to be right or wrong, but at least state them, right? And it drives me crazy today because again, I'm no expert on leadership, but I know all the administrative meetings I hear about, let's get 10 people around the table to come up with a brainstorming idea. All you're going to get is the average. You're not going to get leadership. You're going to get consensus. That's not leadership. Sorry. That is to a part. But to me, you've got to be willing to put your stake in the ground and say, I really think we need to do this. And you don't have to agree with me, but this is why I think it's important, right? So I'm never shy about doing that. And that's always driven new directions in the group and so on. So that's one. And then the other is the age old, I always believe this strongly, you lead by example. So you can't lead by putting out an idea and then disappearing up to Maine for 3 months, right? You have to be here and willing to talk about it and guide and lead and respond. So I don't know. Those are things I think about. Who knows? Leadership is hard to define. So.
Well, let me test a few ideas just out on you, because I do think your success and the lab's success has to have something to do with leadership. And it strikes me that what you've indicated is, one, this conviction and some sense of this can be done. That's number one. And two, the willingness to take risk, which is notably absent in most cases, we find in most organizations. I'd ask you about two others that we keep asking this question of people who have been successful. How important is the ability to communicate? You are someone who is extraordinarily busy, for one thing. What is your communication style? Do you have a lot of written documents that go out? Do you have, how do you communicate in such a way as to sort of mobilize people to move in a direction? What's the magic there?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you for bringing that up. So everything we talk about today, the heart of everything is communication, right? And the style of communication. So to me, you could write all the documents in the world. It's not going to matter. It's, people do these 5-year plans. Boring me to death, right? The Soviet Union lived and died by a 5-year plan, right? So, I don't need to tell you that. To me, communication is all about sitting here, Zoom or in person, looking somebody in the eye and making sure you're trying to understand them, right? Like for me talking to you, I'm trying to understand, okay, what's going to help you, right? And it's amazing how many people don't take that approach. And that's okay. I'm just saying, if you don't understand what somebody's looking for to try and help them, then you're just talking, and I hate just talking. To me, I don't care if I'm sitting here with a student who, is having a problem at home and we're just trying to get to know each other so I can help them that way. So they understand I care, which I do. then the rest becomes easy, because then when it comes to a problem in the lab, they understand I'm trying to help them. I'm not trying to do a disservice. So I just call it, personal attention, one-on-one, and it takes time. It's not something you can rush. It's not something you can program. It's not something you can put a data sheet together on. It's got to be time and attention to those details.
It also strikes me one other thing that we hear when we talk to people from different fields about what constitutes a good leader. More and more people point out that there's a kind of idiosyncratic quality. Now, we found out that some people mean that what they really mean is the person they're talking about is crazy. And what they mean by that is this person doesn't walk to somebody else's drum. They don't play by everybody else's rules. They are willing to take risk, and in some cases, very large risk, knowing that a great deal is at stake. It's not just being right or wrong. It's just people's lives are affected in very direct ways. Is there some tension always there between the need for someone to conform within a larger organization, such as a university, and at the same time, be that kind of idiosyncratic person who doesn't necessarily conform all the time? Do you sense that in your work, that there's this big organization that you're within, and you've got to somehow live within it, but at the same time, in order to be effective within your part of that organization, you have to be a rather different kind of person. Is that tension there for you?
So it could be, but I don't let it. So, and I say it, and I have a very simple answer to it. It's a great question. It's many, many years ago, I had to make a decision, right? To be what I am, an academician, running my lab, being a professor, teaching, which I love to death, right? Or moving up the chain, to be a dean or a provost or a president. Mm-hmm. And I made a decision many years ago. I'd have to go back to my wife and ask when it was, but where I said, I know what I enjoy and I know what I wouldn't enjoy it. I would hate being an administrator, even though I'm department chair, but that I can manage because it's kind of, And so I think you're right. If you go up the chain, then you're going to be more and more conformist because you're living in, the Luddite world of academic hierarchy, right? But if you're running your own lab, no one can tell you what to do. As long as you're teaching, and as long as I raise the money to do what I want to do, and that's why I have the best job on the planet, because
you have autonomy.
Exactly. And that's why I would never survive at a company or whatever, because, this is what I enjoy. It's not for everybody. I understand that. So my answer is, a personal decision not to, interview for deans and other things when they've come across my desk, because I just know I would go home frustrated and unhappy when I would do that. So
I want you to polish off your crystal ball. And yes, that was a pun intended just for you. I want you to speculate a bit. And I know you don't have 5-year plans, but I want you to have at least 5 or 10-year vision. What does this near-term future hold for us in material science? What can we reasonably expect to see in terms of the next round of breakthroughs? What do you think those are going to be?
So, at least from my perspective, things I'm excited about for the future that I think really would fit that window would be, again, a bit biased, but still, looking at nature still and looking at how nature has solved some of the most complex problems in material science and learning more about that and then applying that. So I look at things like, the term we're using these days is living materials, right? So materials that are not static, that are not going to last and do a job and then go away, but they're going to do multiple jobs, or they're going to change with time, or they're going to adapt to the given environment or situation. So I think we're just at the beginning of that, and we're working in those areas very actively right now because we see
Dave, let me introduce, just if I could interrupt on that, because I just want to make sure this is an important point. I think you're talking about the ability to create things that not only do a job, but they do multiple tasks, and they're capable of doing multiple tasks, and they may even be capable of learning.
Absolutely. No question. And like I said, they can also be, I'll give you an example just to make it more real. No one's ever solved biofouling, right? Because the best material in the world still, barnacles grow, bacteria grow, you lose the material properties you designed, and so eventually you have to come by and scrape it off, start over, or replace it, and it goes on. you look at, there's a lot of animals in that environment, and even other plants and other things that you never see anything growing on, right? Or if they do, they're part of that ecosystem, right? They're there by design or evolution or whatever to make it work in sync with that environment. We have no clue how to do that yet. So I think that's the next world of materials, is to make things, like we talked about before. Why do you need to look at all the other stuff along with the material? Because that's where they all exist, right? So to me, people are just starting to think about those things, but there's a long way to go. So that's the world I see going forward, is materials that are dynamic, that are evolving with the system, that maybe synergize with even other organisms in that environment, so that they are working towards whatever that function is you want to design.
It's fascinating that you talk about a world that began to some extent when we finally got around to getting the genome done, and we built off of that. So we started with that task, and now we seem to be spawning more and more out of it. And so that we can begin to talk about multifunction, complex beings and materials that interact with their world and learn from it. I hope that you don't get tired. And I hope you keep going. And when I see you with you said it was going to be a tin cup that I was going to have to put money in. I'll drop a few coins, Dave. I want you to continue. I also want to thank you very much for being with us on Innovators. You're certainly one of those people. Thank you very much.
Well, Rick, thanks so much. I appreciate your interest in what we do, and I really appreciate the time as well. Thank you for what you do as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.